Okay, colleagues, let's continue. So I'm just gonna double check that the stream was working and we'll start. Seems to be live. Okay. So, Socrates, right? So we talked about the context of ancient ethical theory in general. Now, let's talk about Socrates. So I'm just gonna double check that the stream is working. Okay. So, in this section, we confine ourselves to the character Socrates in Plato's dialogues, and indeed only to certain ones of those dialogues in which a Socrates character plays a role. I'm not sure I read this sentence correctly. Anyway, indeed to only certain ones of the dialogues in which a Socrates character plays a role. In those dialogues in which he plays a major role, Socrates varies considerably between two extremes. On the one hand, there is the Socrates who claims to know nothing about virtue and confines himself to asking other characters questions. This Socrates is found in the Apology and in certain dialogues, most of which end inconclusively. So we have a whole set of these early, sometimes called aporetic dialogues. Again, Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy refers to them as Plato's shorter ethical works. Many scholars believe that these are earlier Platonic dialogues, which follow closer, are sort of more closely related to Socrates' own character, as opposed to hypothetical middle period dialogues and later dialogues in which Plato develops his own ideas and uses Socrates simply as a mouthpiece. Anyway, so this Socrates is found in the Apology and in certain dialogues, most of which end inconclusively, again, sometimes with no conclusion at all. These dialogues, for example, Charmides on temperance, they discuss temperance, they reach no conclusion what temperance is. Laches, or Laches, the dialogue, so Laches and Nicias, members of the dialogue, are important Athenian generals, and they discuss courage, and again, the dialogue ends inconclusively, no conclusion is reached. Crito, some of you have read Crito on sort of Socrates presenting um, the view of justice against himself in some sense, the case of the city against Socrates, Euthydemus and Euthyphro. Euthyphro, especially interesting dialogue, especially for theological purposes, where Socrates calls into question, I think, one way to interpret it is calling into question the divine command theory of justice, saying that, asking this question, is something good simply because gods declare it to be good, or is there maybe an universal independent standard of goodness, which is above the gods and to which the gods also have to adhere. Gods or God. Very often, Euthyphro is set against the problem of the binding of Isaac, when Yahweh orders Abraham to kill his son, to sacrifice his son Isaac in Genesis, right, in the Bible. Anyway, so so these dialogues are called aporetic because they end in aporia, impasse, dead end. On the other hand, in other dialogues, we find a Socrates who expounds positive teachings about virtue. This Socrates usually asks questions only to elicit agreement. These dialogues are didactic and conclusive in tone, and the examples include Republic, Phaedo, Phaedrus, and Philebus. However, these distinctions between kinds of dialogues and kinds of Socratic character are not exclusive. There are dialogues that mix the aporetic and conclusive styles, for example, Protagoras, Meno, and Gorgias. In observing these distinctions, we refer only to the characteristic style of the dialogue and leave aside controversies about relative dates of composition of the dialogues. So controversies about relative dates, composition of the dialogues, keep talking about this every class. You probably should be, getting familiar with this by now. So see the entry on Plato, especially section on Socrates, section on historical Socrates. Anyway, the significance of this distinction among dialogues is that one can isolate a strain of moral teaching in the aporetic and mixed dialogues. In spite of their inconclusive nature, in the aporetic dialogues, the character Socrates maintains principles about morality that he seems to take to be fundamental. In the mixed dialogues, we find similar teaching. This strain is distinct enough from the accounts of morality in the more didactic dialogues that it has been called Socratic as opposed to Platonic. Socratic as opposed to Platonic, and associated with the historical personage's own views, so associated with Socrates himself, right? In what follows, we limit ourselves to this Socratic moral teaching without taking a position about the relation of Socratic moral teaching to that of the historical Socrates. Again, I think, academically speaking, a deeply appropriate position. Socrates never wrote anything. It's hard to reconstruct what he thought. So, we can talk about this in this relative fashion. For our purposes, it is sufficient to point out a distinction between kinds of moral teachings in the dialogues. So again, so for our purposes, it is sufficient, it is enough to understand that in Plato we can find two different strands of moral teaching. That's enough for our purposes. We will focus on the Apologetic dialogues as well as the mixed dialogues Protagoras, Gorgias, and Meno. The first feature of Socratic teaching is its heroic quality. In the Apology, Socrates says that a man worth anything at all does not reckon whether his course of action endangers his life or threatens death. Heroic quality. It doesn't matter whether the right course of action leads you to risk your life. He looks only at one thing, whether what he does is just or not, the work of a good or a bad man. Said in the context of his trial, this statement is both about himself and a fundamental claim of his moral teaching. Socrates puts moral considerations above all others. If we think of justice as roughly the way we treat others, the just actions to which he refers cover a wide range. It is now let's think about this. These are interesting examples. It is unjust to rob temples, betray friends, steal, break oaths, commit adultery, and mistreat parents. Interesting, right? So on the one hand, we seem to be talking. Sorry. So on the one hand, we seem to be talking about these very fundamental issues of justice, putting everything on the table. Remember in the very beginning we asked how ancient Greeks had different visions of human excellence. Somebody like Callicles would say that an excellent life is a life of unbridled Machiavellian hedonism, trying to get as much power and satisfy as many desires as you want. And this would count as excellence for Callicles. Or Odysseus in Homer's Iliad and Odyssey is excellent because he's an excellent liar and an excellent pirate. Achilles is excellent because he's an excellent killer. Again, in this fit of rage, right? But on the other hand, it seems to be an assumption of Socrates that his vision of justice, even though it's different from traditional morality, again, Socrates disagrees with Cephalus. He's going to criticize traditional morality, but still, Socrates does agree that at the end of the day, life properly understood. So even though he says he knows that he knows nothing, remember, we're talking about Socrates. We're talking about these quote-unquote early Socratic dialogues. Still, Socrates seems to believe that it is unjust to rob temples, betray friends, steal, break oaths, commit adultery, and mistreat parents. Interesting. A similarly strong statement about wrongdoing is found in the Crito, where the question is whether Socrates should save his life by escaping from jail in Athens and aborting the sentence of death. Socrates says that whether he should escape or not must be governed only by whether it is just or unjust to do so. Obviously, by posing wrongdoing against losing one's life, Socrates means to emphasize that nothing outweighs in positive value the disadvantage of doing unjust actions. Nothing outweighs in positive value the disadvantage of doing unjust actions. Again, we're going to get to this when we get to John Stuart Mill. Again, this example of the firefighter. An excellent firefighter prefers to risk their life rather than face dishonor. Anyway, in such passages, then, Socrates seems to be a moral hero willing to sacrifice his very life rather than commit an injustice, and to recommend such heroism to others. However, this heroism also includes an important element of self-regard. An important element of self-regard. In the passage from the Apostle, so this is not self-sacrifice. This is not Christian self-denial. I cannot stress this enough. Socrates is not Jesus, as far as I can tell. Okay, we're not talking about self-denial. It's an important element of self-regard. In the passage from the Apology, just quoted, Socrates goes on to describe his approach to the citizens of Athens. He chides them, so he reproaches them, right? Chides them for being absorbed. He reproaches them for being absorbed in the acquisition of wealth, reputation, and honor. So not wealth, reputation, of honor, but taking care of the soul, right, is important. So Socrates reproaches the Athenians for being absorbed in acquisition of wealth, reputation, and honor, while they do not take care nor think about wisdom, truth, and how they make their souls better. Uh, Forgive me for making this offhanded remark. When we'll talk about Jean-Jacques Rousseau, this idea about amour de soi and amour propre, right? So amour propre is this desire to impress others, to look good in the eyes of others. This acquisition of wealth, reputation, honor. Whereas Rousseau says that true happiness lies in caring for one's soul. It's amour de soi. Both amour de soi and amour propre can be translated as love of self, but these are very different ways in which one can love oneself. One is, true care for one's soul, and the other one is egotistical desire to be envied. Anyway, goes back to Socrates apparently. I mean this seriously. So as Socrates develops this idea, it becomes clear that the perfection of the soul, making it better, means acquiring and having moral virtue. Rather than heaping up riches and honor, Athenians should seek to perfect their souls in virtue. Again, we'll talk about this in a second. Again, riches and honor don't make you happy. Riches and honor can allow you to do certain actions, but these actions can make you happy or make you unhappy. Again, having a lot of money, you can use this money for good, for your own good, or you can use this money to harm others and also to harm yourself. And not to mention that. Well, anyway, let me not continue. So rather than heaping up riches and honor, Athenians should seek to perfect their souls in virtue. Excellence of the soul, right? From this exhortation, we can conclude that for Socrates, psychological good outweighs material good, and that virtue is a psychological good of the first importance. The Crito gives another perspective of psychological good. Socrates says, as something obvious to everyone, that life is not worth living if that which is harmed by disease and benefited by health, for example, the body, that is to say, the body, is ruined. So life is not worth living if the body is ruined. Life is not worth living if the body is ruined. So it doesn't matter how much money you have. If your health is ruined, if you are crippled by disease, wealth does nothing for you. But likewise, he adds, life is not worth living is that which is harmed by wrongdoing, is benefited by the right, the soul is ruined. So again, life is not worth living if the body is ruined, and by the same token, life is not worth living if the soul is ruined. Should we think about this in terms of psychological disease? Well, to some extent, yes, because again, especially, so this is not Socrates, but Plato. Plato is going to emphasize harmony in the soul. You can live in an enormous mansion and be torn apart by desire, be unsatisfied, your soul being in disharmony. Or you can live in the street, like Diogenes of Sinope, right? Diogenes the cynic, and be contented with that. So again, life is not worth living if the soul is ruined. Again, having a mansion, if you are torn apart by tyrannical desires, and you are still unhappy, and you are less happy than a Diogenes who can, tell Alexander to get out of his light. Okay, so we can understand Socrates' claim in positive terms. Virtue is the chief psychological good. Wrongdoing destroys virtue. Again, and let's not presuppose that we understand what virtue is. Socrates, in saying this, also is defining virtue in a particular way. So Socrates' strong commitment to virtue reflects his belief in its value for the soul, as well as the importance of the soul's condition for the quality of our lives. Quality of our lives. So again, a self-regarding element for Socrates. Again, I kept talking about this immanent and transcendent criterion. Again, you see, Socrates, this is very different from Abrahamic monotheism. This is not a divine command theory of justice. You should do what is right. And you know what is right because it feels right. It provides the health of your soul, if you want. And you feel it from within. There is an immanent criterion. Again, care of the soul, care of the self, irrespective of the question of what happens to you after you die. Not to mention that, again, I think Socrates would say that slavish submission to the rules of some god, simply because you're afraid that this god may punish you after you're dead, it's slavery. It's not a moral thing to do. Again, he says you should do the right thing regardless of the consequences, says Socrates. Anyways, this heroic morality. Although, again, regardless, I mean, consequences are important. Consequences for the soul are important. So consequences of the right kind are important. Anyway, the second feature of Socratic teaching is its intellectualism. This is also important. And this is going to be a big difference between Socrates on the one hand and Plato and Aristotle on the other hand. So this is the defining trait of Socratic ethics. Everything else is tends to be more common. In the Meno, Socrates argues that no one knowingly desires what is bad. No one does wrong willingly. His argument shows that by bad, he means that things are harmful to the subject, so things which are harmful to me. The one who would desire these things. So to myself, right? In Protagoras, Socrates makes a similar point when he says that it is not in human nature for someone to wish to go after what he thinks is bad in place of the good. So again, this no one does wrong willingly. John Stuart Mill, when he says that utilitarianism goes back to Socrates, that Socrates is the founder of utilitarianism, he means exactly these lines from Gorgias and Protagoras. Or Meno, I suppose, here. I think Gorgias will be referenced later. Anyway, even if we understand good and bad here, as Socrates seems to intend, to be what is good for the subject, and what is bad and harmful for the subject, the claim is still paradoxical, says Richard Parry. It seems to be obvious that humans sometimes desire to have and wish to go after what they know will be harmful. People can all too easily desire and go after the chocolate that they know is bad for them. Socrates, however, seems to think that we wish for or desire only what we take to be good for us. Again, in some sense, you can see in this the traces of utilitarianism or traces of this rationalism, higher rational hedonism, So you are looking for again what John Stuart Mill is going to call higher pleasures, true happiness. And the reason why you choose higher pleasures over lower pleasures is because higher pleasures are more pleasant. Again, I really apologize for these biographical examples, but I find it more pleasant to read this article from Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy out loud than I find this more pleasurable than stuffing my face full of ice cream or watching cartoons. Which is why I'm doing this again. Sorry. I understand references to personal biography is not controversial and problematic in many ways. Anyway, back to the article. People can all too easily desire and go after the chocolate that they know is bad for them. Socrates, however, seems to think that we wish for or desire only what we take to be good for us. Once a person really knows and fully appreciates that the chocolate is not good in this way, one will truly cease to desire it. There is no residual desire, that is pleasure, that might compete with the desire for what is good. This position is called intellectualism because it implies that what ultimately motivates any action is some cognitive state. If you know what is good, you will do it. And if you do an action and it is bad, that was because you mistakenly thought somehow that it was good. I think it's a plausible position. Plato is going to modify this position in the Republic, and we're gonna see this in a second. But this is associated with Socrates again. This again, intellectualism about ethics. All errors in such choices are due to ignorance. So in some sense, again, virtue or excellence is due to knowledge, and vice, injustice, is due to ignorance only. No one does wrong willingly. Socratic intellectualism has two significant consequences. One is that virtue, which guarantees good action, is knowledge, and the other is that virtue is sufficient for happiness. Virtue is knowledge, and virtue is sufficient for happiness. Both are elaborated in the dialogue Euthydemus. While most of the dialogue is given over to the Euthydemus and Dionysiodorus and their eristic display of sophistic rhetorical skill, there are two Socratic interludes. In the first of these, in a passage that has a parallel in Meno, Socrates helps the young Clinias to see that wisdom is a kind of knowledge that infallibly brings happiness. Wisdom is a kind of knowledge that infallibly brings happiness. He uses an analogy with craft, techne. A carpenter must not only have, but know how to use his tools and materials to be successful. In turn, someone may have such goods as health, wealth, good birth, and beauty, as well as the virtues of justice, moderation, courage, and wisdom. Wisdom is the most important, however, because it is a kind of knowledge like carpentry about how to use the other assets so that they are beneficial. Moreover, all of these other so-called goods are useless and, in fact, even harmful without wisdom. Because without wisdom, again, uh, without wisdom, things like wealth or health are not necessarily beneficial, but could in fact be harmful or useless. So without wisdom, because without wisdom, one will misuse any one of these assets one may possess so as to act not well but badly, and to make oneself not happy but unhappy. Wisdom is the only unconditional good. Wisdom is the only unconditional good. Very interesting, very interesting. Socrates' argument leaves it ambiguous whether wisdom, taken together with its exercise, is identical with happiness or whether it is the dominant and essential component of happiness. In this account, the focus is on a kind of knowledge as the active ingredient in happiness. The other parts of account are certain assets that seem as passive in relation to wisdom as wood and tools are to the carpenter. Further, since there seems to be no opposition to the work of reason in the soul, Socrates' account seems a bit naive. So again, we're going to talk about this parts of the soul, how you can know what is the right thing, but you're overcome by your appetites. Plato is going to talk about this in a second. Socrates, and therefore Socrates' account, which doesn't take into consideration this potential conflict within the soul, seems a bit naive. In fact, the neglect of the complexities of moral psychology goes hand in hand with Socratic intellectualism. Okay. And this is the end of the section on Socrates. And I wonder if maybe I should, just for fun, separate the stream into several portions and start Plato off in the next section.